I've started recording.
Thank you. So we'll go through the slide deck for the 10-year telecom plan. So the first slide, this is going to just give you a brief overview. The public comment version of the plan is out on the website, so we can get started. We'll go to the next slide. We'll go with the plan context, the research and analysis, some basic findings and recommendations that are in the plan. So next slide, please. So the 10-year plan, as you know, is guided by the telecommunication goals in 30 VSA 202C. The plan has been created in accordance with the process established in 30 VSA 202D. It builds on the momentum created by the federal resources, ARPA, CPF, and the BEAD and broadband digital equity plans. So while it addresses all statutory requirements, we have made an effort to place a special focus on the elements not addressed in the simultaneous BEAD plan. I believe the legislature made it fairly clear with Act 71 that they would like the VCBB to be the primary focus for the fiber to the home and broadband across the state for that piece. So we don't want this plan to step on their feet. Next slide. So the research that underpins the plan, the landline and cellular phone survey of a statistically significant sampling of residents, an online survey of businesses, healthcare and public safety professionals, interviews with over 55 public and private stakeholders, statewide mobile wireless engineering and coverage analysis, and a scientific input-output workforce gap analysis based on broadband construction spending. Next slide. So that's kind of Philip. Thank you. So one of the things that we found or that was discovered in the writing of the plan was that fiber coverage is expanding rapidly, but stakeholders identified small challenges. Households with access to 100 megabit symmetrical more than doubled between 2021 and 2023. Vermont is on track to pass all on-grid premises by 2029. But with that, Vermont needs to grow its broadband construction workforce. Between 2018 and 22, the broadband deployment workforce shrank by 12%. Building 700 million in fiber deployments will require growing that workforce by roughly 750 workers. Fiber infrastructure owners may need to bury portions of their network in the next 10 to 15 years as part of utility hardening, but costs and responsibilities are unclear. AOT no longer issues right-of-way permit waivers, increasing the cost of deployment in unserved areas. Next slide. When the research was done regarding the mobile wireless service, we've obviously flagged mobile wireless as critical, but limited coverage expansion has occurred. 80% of surveyed businesses indicated mobile wireless coverage is inadequate for their business needs. 64% of surveyed residents strongly agreed that the state should use public funds to improve mobile wireless coverage. Broadband speeds have increased about sixfold since 2018, but the actual coverage areas have seen little improvement. And it's been pointed out that over 400 miles of roads still lack any sort of coverage from any provider. Some engineering analysis was done to show that strategically placing small wireless facilities under 50 feet tall can make significant progress towards closing the easiest 50% of those gaps. Ubiquitous fiber and small facilities will be less than half the cost of the standard 140-foot towers. So next slide, please. Excuse me. One of the other things that was pointed out in the last plan was some affordability issues. So the affordability of services is significantly challenged by the sunset of the ACP. So the ACP has not yet been renewed at the federal level. And although stakeholders strongly note that both fixed and mobile connectivity are important, the ACP only covers one of those services. It's set to expire, not set to expire, but it's set to run out of money in about April of this year. 12% of the people with disabilities and 30% of income-based government assistance recipients participate in the ACP. 16% of survey respondents under the age of 45 reported that the cost of their mobile cellular bill often or always impacts the essential items they can afford. And healthcare workers noted that without continuous mobile coverage and access to devices, unhoused Vermonters will continue to struggle to get access to care. Next slide. Public safety systems will continue to evolve, and the mobile check coverage remains an issue. Peer states have consolidated the PSAPs in varying degrees. The advantage of this is increased staffing flexibility, improved coverage, more resources for statewide emergencies, and long-term cost savings. The disadvantages of this is the need for new governance systems and processes, a fairly large upfront cost of system migration, and a potential loss of local control and knowledge, and the need for new redundancy and failover processes. Currently, a lack of state funding is a barrier to executing the goals of a statewide communications interoperability plan, which require in some federal grant applications. To date, over 50 FirstNet sites have been deployed. However, only 5.6% of public safety survey respondents report never losing mobile service on the job. Next slide. And finally, before we get into the recommendations, the statute could be more specific and better aligned with current state strategy. Broadband speed definitions and minimum deployment parameters are starting to lag behind some other states. Just as a comment, I think we've seen that. The FCC, I think this week or last week, recently upped the definition of broadband from 25.3 to officially 100/20. Statutorily mandated end date for the VCBB is most likely going to be before all the BEAD program activities are concluded. And the goals first drafted 40 years ago contain some overlapping and non-specific language. Next slide. So then we'll get into a fairly small selection of the key recommendations in the plan. The state can take small actions to make wireline deployment more efficient. It can reinstate the AOT permit fee waivers until the state achieves universal 100/100 broadband service. Can scale training programs to ensure Vermont's workforce is skilled, qualified, and ready to execute the necessary construction. Calibrate the scale of state training programs to projected workforce needs, and set a goal to recruit 3 times as many critical workers to training programs as needed to account for turnover and retirements. Lead a study among infrastructure owners of process and cost of burying infrastructure, the impact of the ISPs and fiber-owned financials, and opportunities for savings and alignment. Next slide. We can encourage small facility wireless deployments via a pilot grant program. Pilot a small facilities, less than 50-foot mobile wireless grant program to address coverage gaps while preserving landscape aesthetics. Proposed to dedicate $2 to $3 million for initial pilot program and collect data to adjust future iterations of the program. Update data collection practices to strengthen state planning abilities and better measure mobile coverage progress. We propose to repeat the 2022 mobile broadband drive test with a cadence of every 2 years to keep that map updated. We looked at establishing a crowdsourced drive test practice to increase the coverage of that drive test on class 2 and 3 roads. And finally, requesting that 248A permit recipients notify the Public Service Department upon completion of a tower so that we can better maintain the map of currently deployed towers that we have across the state. Next slide. Ensure affordability of both wireline and wireless service for low-income residents. Use 2% of the monthly income as a definition for affordable for fixed and mobile broadband spending for low-income Vermonters. Establish a state-run subsidy program to provide up to $67 a month to low-income Vermonters for both wireline and wireless broadband subscriptions. And establish a program to provide fully subsidized mobile devices and mobile subscriptions to unhoused Vermonters to ensure continuous access to services. Next slide. Oh, you're already there. Strengthen the state's emergency communication systems. Federal grants are unavailable. Dedicate sufficient state funding to execute on goals and objectives in the SCIP. If stakeholders support PSAP consolidation, fund a dedicated detailed consolidation plan. The plan will illuminate specific costs of consolidation and potential long-term savings. Next slide. And finally, modernize the statute to better align or better guide practices and align with state strategies. ensure statutory goals in 30 VSA 202C and 30 VSA 202D are specific and aligned with Act 71. Extend the Vermont Community Broadband Board's sunset date to provide adequate oversight and monitoring of the BEAD deployments, and consider aligning the statutory goals with ongoing deployment strategies. He set the goals to address the intended benefits of competition, which are better speeds, lower costs, and better customer service, rather than specifically insist on more competition. Next slide, that's it. That is a brief slide deck overview of the plan. Again, the plan is on the website for your viewing pleasure. Harley can send you out the direct link as well if you'd like to look. There's been a couple press releases, advertisements, and announcements with a link to it, but we'll make sure to get that to you if you haven't already seen it.
Great, thank you, Hunter and Harley, and to the department for the work you've put into this. I think we can open up to the board for questions or comments.
I can see Costa has a question with his hand up.
Okay. Yeah, I'm having a hard time with my screen. Go ahead, Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on the issue of access permit fees by the Agency of Transportation, I'm going to forward some additional language for context, because that authority to waive those access fees was not limited to telecommunications. It was broader, and it had to do with an authority from the legislature to do that during the COVID crisis. So it's not that the Agency of Transportation is reinstituting access fees. It's that the authority to do so is no longer available. So just a point of clarification. I also had a comment on the subsidy for mobile services. I was curious as to why they were combined with wireline. It seems to me with the MVNOs out there, the cost of mobile services has dropped dramatically, and I was curious as to why they were bundled with wireline that tend to be way more expensive than MVNO services on the wireless side. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hunter, are you able to respond to Costa's question about the wireline and wireless?
I don't have the plan in front of me, but it's my understanding that the $67 would encompass the subsidy for both. Currently, the subsidy for wireline, I believe, is $30 through the ACP. So the extra money would be able to use to subsidize wireless, which we have found through research is what most lower income and housing challenged individuals tend to use for broadband access.
Thank you.
Evan, you had a question?
Yep, I have a couple thoughts. First off, I just want to say I do really appreciate the kind of updated format and the summary recommendations, which include suggested leads and kind of who should be taking on the work outlined in the recommendations. So definitely, I think that's a vastly improved version from what was produced from the last plan. So thank you for that. A couple other things, just kind of generally speaking, is I think it'd be really helpful to include specific measurements for success on each of these items, and potentially recommended timelines for them, like when would be kind of the drop dead date for some of these different proposals that are there. You know, obviously things like the updates to the statutory requirements for VCBB or VCBB, that's something that needs to happen pretty soon if we're going to try to actually, you know, that's probably the next session that needs to be done. And so the recommendation is right, but what's the actual timeline to get that done? The other thought is on the topic of the modernization. I see the suggested lead is the legislature, which, yes, they are the kind of ultimate decision makers on that, but it seems like the PSD needs to be the one that's actually driving that. and ensuring that that work actually gets done. So I just would like to see that there's some level of accountability to try to enforce some of those things, or not enforce it, but make sure that there's some forward movement there.
I mean, in the statute,
Yeah,
drives
in the
the
statute.
statutory
Right.
changes, drives the language.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, because I think, obviously the legislature has a lot of different things they would like to do, but, the idea of having you guys helping push that forward and making sure that it is priority, will be important. Because all these other things are also important as well, and I could definitely see that those things falling lower on the list, if not continually pushed. I had one other thought as well. So on the mobile wireless side of things, is there wasn't a ton, there was like a brief mention of it, but I think really the idea of leveraging the CUDs that do have fiber infrastructure for getting some of the deployments into place for some of the small cells, or for some of the test sites that you're talking about deploying, would make a lot of sense. And so I think there just needs to be some level of deeper collaboration between the CUDs and that mobile plan. So it wasn't a kind of big bullet in there, but I think it's worth kind of going back and potentially revisiting some aspects of that. We have this publicly owned infrastructure, and so it should be utilized to the fullest extent from my perspective. That's all I have for the moment.
Thanks, Evan. Lindsay, do you have any comments or questions?
I'm all set right now. Thank you, Dave.
Okay. One question I had, some of the recommendations, especially those like regarding workforce, the sunsetting of the Vermont Community Broadband Board, or the funding for the wireless grant program, are any of those actually, is there any legislation being proposed in this session that we need to be aware of? There's a lot to keep track of these days, as you know.
So say it again, the workforce, the VCBB, what was the third one?
The wireless grant program funding that you mentioned, it was a recommendation.
No, there's been no legislation proposed for those as far as I know. So the VCBB language would come from the VCBB, and we haven't even finalized a plan. So my expectation would be that language would be proposed next session, honestly.
Okay. Should we move on to the next agenda item?
Just for my clarity, and I know it's outlined, but I just would like to have it outlined here, is just the next steps and process that you're planning to take to kind of move this forward.
Which P7?
The 10-year plan.
So the 10-year, the public comment plan has been drafted. For statute, we are conducting 3 meetings. I don't think that part is for statute, but we are currently in the public comment phase with the public comment draft of the plan. Once we get all the comments, we will either update the plan or respond to the comments in writing in the plan, and then put the final draft back out, where we will go to St. Albans, Randolph, Springfield, as well as meet with JITALK.
And have you been getting much public comment to date?
We've had a limited amount of public comment so far. We've had some, but.
And has there been a kind of area of focus for the majority of it, or is it more widespread?
I personally found it to be more widespread.
Okay.
I'll respond to that when you get some public comments.
Are people showing up at the opportunities for in-person?
I believe we had 1 participant the first meeting. We had 4 participants the second meeting, and we have another meeting on next Monday. So we'll see.
Okay, thanks.
Next agenda item, Hunter.
The future of the board. I think
Good question.
it has been suggested a couple times that you have recommended that the TCAB be disbanded. So I think that bears discussion. Your public servants, we don't make that recommendation. If that is a recommendation that you all come to, then I think it would be best for it to come in writing from the chair of the board to me, and I can pass it up the chain and then work it from there. If that's not the recommendation, then continue to schedule these meetings as statutorily required.
Mr. Chair, I'd ask you to hear public comment before y'all make a decision on this.
Lindsay has her hand up.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I just have some questions. So I think one of the questions I would have before making a decision would be, with the creation of the Vermont Community Broadband Board, is there something that we would do that they wouldn't do? Is there some reason to keep us going because there's some gap?
this board used to be responsible for advising on the investments from the connectivity fund, which is no longer in place. I think the Vermont Community Broadband Board assumed a lot of the responsibilities that this board had, maybe an exception being the advisement on this long-term plan. But it's almost because we're in statute, we have to keep meeting, but it's 2022 was our recommendation that we disband or sunset.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
So for clarity, the connectivity fund still quasi exists, but it now goes to the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
Yeah.
When there's any money left, it goes to them.
Costa?
Yeah, so I was curious, does the VCCB have a mandate to look at telecommunications policy broadly, or is it limited to the scope of broadband deployment and related activities?
I need to read Act 71, but it's my understanding that it is related to fiber to the home and broadband activities.
Thank
That's
you.
correct. I think that is correct. The mobile wireless piece is something that falls outside of it, and I don't know if there's other places where it is discussed, and there's another board that has some level of oversight on it, but that is obviously one part of the work that we're doing as well.
Okay, so just to clarify, what I'm hearing is there could be a gap for the for the mobile wireless. There could be. Okay.
And I guess for telecom policy generally, right? Items that may fall outside the scope, excuse me, of mobile may also be a gap.
Agreed.
Would it be would it be something that we could intentionally highlight as a gap and put into the hands of the VCBB, or does that not make sense? I just don't want something to be left out.
There's a long list of them, Lindsay. I'll be happy to apprise you.
Be happy to hear from you soon, but
Hunter, does the department have any thoughts on that?
So I don't want to speak for the VCBB, but I don't believe it's their charge to deal with mobile wireless.
Okay.
okay.
I think that's fair. I do think that there's aspects of it, being that, there's many discussions happening around CUDs taking the position of an ILAC, or, taking on some of that responsibility as being the carrier of last resort, which, traditionally was falling to other telecommunications providers. So I think it's worth a discussion to see if there is a space for it, but I don't think that that was the intention originally of the VCBB. And there absolutely is still a major challenge as highlighted in the plan relating to mobile wireless in the state. And so I still think it's a priority, even though there's been a significant amount of funding and effort put towards wired line solutions. The mobile wireless solution is not getting any better.
Right, yeah, I think that my predecessor had requested funding in 2 separate legislative sessions to do some work for some mobile wireless pilot projects, and both times it was not funded.
That's a concern to me for a couple of reasons. One is cellular access for any number of reasons for residents, visitors, businesses, but also this idea that was alluded to earlier, that in some cases cellular or mobile is being used as a broadband service. And if that's the case, that speaks to competitiveness and affordability, which I'm always concerned about. The more these services are available, the more the cost competitive environment is going to make services affordable. So I read the executive summary of the report that talks about mobile coverage gaps, and it's a really high number. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Does it make sense to have, I mean, the modernization of the statutory requirements might just need to be revamped to really consider what is the actual focus of this board if it is going to be continuing on. And maybe that's the main kind of charge for us, is to push the legislature to revamp that and give some focus to what we're supposed to be doing. That would be my thought and recommendation.
I'm wondering if we just look at what the Vermont Community Broadband Board does not cover and find and identify those responsibilities. And then if we're asking that sunset to be extended beyond 2029, to maybe push those responsibilities to that board. Just a thought. We want to hear from Mr. Whitaker, public comment.
Move into a public comment, see?
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I've started off the cuff compiling a list of all the gaps that would be left wide open were the Telecom and Connectivity Board to recommend it cease to exist. Specifically in statute, I call your attention to section 202 E and F. E is the connectivity division, and they're supposed to do a whole bunch of work of mapping dead zones and providing annual mapping and report to the legislature. But they're also supposed to be advised by this Telecom and Connectivity Board in preparing that report and in assessing the progress on the 10-year plan. In the absence of that, I did a records request for the Broadband Action Plan from the department just last week, and the answer was 2024 Broadband Action Plan. The department does not produce nor possess a document by that name, and I do hereby certify pursuant to public records law. So this gap that you're talking about is causing flagrant violations of existing statute. And this draft that you were just read a scripted slide deck from, scripted by a contractor, is so deficient in that it is written assuming that the statutes were already changed. It's written from a point of view of what we wish the statutes are rather than what the statutes are today. And that is just, that should get your interest up as a telecom governing board. You should be advising that that's no way to write a plan. We have to write a plan to today's statutes, not statutes we hope someday will be implemented. So that list of gaps that would be created would, if this, and which are not appropriate to shift to the broadband board, are carrier grade service to support what is also called public safety grade service to state police radio towers and regional public safety communications equipment, and small cells that might be publicly owned or managed. Mobile wireless, which was recommended to be included in the broadband board scope, but the broadband board members opposed it and came into Senate GovOps and said, no, we don't want that responsibility. And I had attempted to put that in there so that the planning would be integrated and most cost effective. Public safety communications entirely. There's an interim public safety communications task force, and they've hired a very capable contracting firm, which is going to produce a plan a year from now that will become a core element of a real telecom plan, but that's a year from now. So I'll stop that list, pause that list for a second and tell you that my recommendation here is that we ask the legislature this session to extend the adoption date for the 2024 plan to become a 2025 plan. Let this contractor who shortchanged us last time to the tune of $200,000 worth of work and is doing the same this year to the tune of $400,000 worth of work, let them take their money and run, and we'll get back to focusing on a real statutorily compliant telecom plan. Back to the list. Resilience of statewide infrastructure is not part of the broadband board's mission. Video conferencing, cloud-hosted video conferencing that can survive a disaster and help rebuild and respond to a disaster is not in there. The role of the AMOs in recording civic discourse and possibly providing assistance in public information and education during disasters. Open access and competitive choice. Clearly defined requirements in the statutory policy and goals of 202C, which the broadband board has flagrantly denied, and this draft plan hopes to dissolve those requirements. But competition is in statute, and the current strategy is to avoid and deny that it exists in statute and to try to get away with writing a plan that does not lay out strategies to implement open access and competitive choice for consumers. Disaster preparedness, backup power as we move more and more landlines, copper-based central office battery backed up service to fiber. That leaves those new customers who have switched to voice over IP over fiber without an ability to call for help when the power is out. That's a massive problem that we're exacerbating with the current strategy, and the department and this body have not yet dealt with it in any meaningful way. Carrier of last resort, I won't speak to because Hunter has mentioned it. The education sector, and how about the AT&T FirstNet outage just a few weeks ago? That's a massive outage of a network that we invested $25 million of NTIA money into a secret architecture by AT&T. But this plan documents that we've had no meaningful increase in cell coverage since 2018. And so the question becomes, what did we get for our 25 million and 30 million worth of spectrum? So, but I want to point to the fact that it's premature to even be having a public review draft, because the statute reads, and I'm reading from 202D here, that prior to preparing the plan, the department shall prepare an overview looking 10 years ahead of statewide growth and development, future requirements for services, patterns of expansion, economic growth, shifts in transportation, economic development, technological advances, and factors that will significantly affect telecommunications policy and programs. The overview shall include an economic and demographic forecast sufficient to determine infrastructure investments, goals, and objectives. None of that is in this draft plan. Secondly, what are the surveys? There are some surveys in the plan. I won't speak to their whether they meet statistically significant, but they require the educational sector to be analyzed. There's nothing about distance learning and pandemic response and the shortcomings and the weaknesses and the possible mitigating factors for distance learning in a forced kind of pandemic environment, nor for the bandwidth limitations in certain areas. The healthcare and human services sector. No mention of how we're going to, human services includes corrections, There's no mention of how corrections, remote adjudication hearings, bail hearings, visitation with family members is going to be supported by telecommunications, workforce training and development, and public safety sector. There's no mention of the entire microwave network, which we've invested millions upon millions on. It's not even referenced in here. And yet the statute requires an assessment of current state and telecommunications infrastructure. So without going into all the detail, oh, Hunter forgot to mention that there are transcripts of these first hearing, in which I was the only speaker, the second hearing in which one state senator and then Lauren Glenn Davidian, myself, and FX Flynn spoke at. Those transcripts would reveal a lot of the shortcomings of this plan. But if they didn't, it doesn't take a lawyer to read this plan and read the statutes and say the prerequisites haven't been met. We shouldn't even be calling this a preliminary draft. But it's clear from what you've seen prior to the recording being turned on that the department intends to double down and try to barrel on and bluff through with a grossly deficient plan grossly in violation of statute. And they're asking for your contribution to that charade. And so I would ask that you consider just supporting the recommendation that the legislature extend the deadline and then reconvene, get some new appointments, reconvene, and talk about how we're going to fill the gaps in the plan, because we can't rely on people who are willing to flagrantly ignore the statute to complete this plan. And we can't rely on people who are flagrantly ignoring the contract terms, both on the last plan and this plan, to complete this plan.
All right. Well, thank you for your comments, Stephen. I know we have this being recorded, but if you have any comments you want to please submit to the department in writing, that would be very helpful. And I will mention that this is a draft plan still, so there is time to make improvements. And I guess our board will decide whether we want to pursue the recommendation to extend the date from 2024 to 2025.
But will you decide that?
We haven't even discussed it yet, so I'm not sure what the board's
right. But you haven't met for 2 years, so are you scheduling another meeting?
We have not scheduled another meeting at this point in time. If we do schedule another meeting, I think we'd like to do that in concert with the department and Commissioner Tierney. So.
You mean hold the first of 8 annual meetings with the department, the commissioner, and the public? That would be impressive indeed.
Well, do other board members have thoughts, comments?
I think it's worth it.
Yeah, I'd like time to think about, not just Mr. Whitaker's comments, but, there's other public comments that are rolling in, and certainly like time to think about that. And yeah, so another meeting, after we've had some time to reflect would be great.
I think ideally before the end of the session, so at some point in April, because then we can actually maybe get something updated from the modernization perspective, at least on our statute, maybe in this session.
Okay.
Lindsay, could I recommend that you ask the governor to make it all 5 appointments that are 5 public appointments, because and to renew Evan and David, should they be willing? Because right now we've only got 2 of the 5 governor's appointments on this meeting.
I will have a conversation with the governor, the lead of the boards in commission, to just have them take a look at what's out of alignment. How's that?
That's great. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, Hunter, what's next on the agenda?
That was the final piece, was a public comment piece. I politely say we do have a very hard stop at 10:30, as this room is going to be filled up with other people. So I think that leaves us with 14 minutes.
That's fine. And Secretary Curley, I can connect with you about maybe your communications with the governor outside of this meeting.
Sounds good.
And then I'll get in touch with Commissioner Tierney and talk about scheduling a next meeting in concert with the department. How's that sound? In April sounds like a good time. Evan's correct. Yeah. All right. Any other comments or questions before we adjourn? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Make the motion.
I'll
Second,
second.
all in favor, let's say aye.
I,
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Thanks
Well,
all.
thank you. Thank you,
Thank you
Hunter
all.
and
Great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank
thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.